All right, greetings everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, we would like to welcome you to Fundraising Communications #2, one of the many webinars that our Fundraising Communications group does for us. And we are broadcasting live from Chicago, and Andy and I are sharing a webcam because I was not able to get my webcam working. So here we are together, we're like the radio show hosts. But before we begin today's presentation, we just want to quickly go over some best practices with you. So first, close any programs other than GoTo that are running on your computer. We do recommend calling in with your telephone instead of using your computer speakers, and move your cell phone away from your computer if there are any sort of issues that happen with that. And then if you experience any visual issues, send a chat to Campbell & Company, or you can contact GoTo directly at the number on your screen. And also today's webinar will last about 60 minutes, and you'll earn one certification with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes that information on how to download your certificate. And yes, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link following today's presentation to our YouTube account, so make sure to check that out. And Andy will be facilitating questions throughout. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andy, and I'm going to slide on out. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Sarah. All right. Yeah, we got all kinds of webcam issues today. So my external webcam is not working. So I'm using the one that's integrated on my laptop, but I just got this new laptop, and the webcam is in the lower left corner of the screen. So anytime I'm talking to the screen, it looks like I'm looking off in the wrong direction. I did an interview recently with someone who we were considering for one of our open positions, and I was trying to connect with this person who's going to potentially be a member of our team, and the whole time it's like I'm looking off center and up away from their eye line. It's really a terrible place for a webcam to be located, but it's the only one that's working today, so that's what we're going to do. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us for Fundraising Communications 2, Crafting Your Message. I'm really excited to share this one with you. This is probably, I love all my children equally, but this is secretly actually my favorite webinar, and I make sure that I say that every time. So this is really, because this gets to the heart of the work that our team does, and Campbell & Company's fundraising communications team. That's the team that I lead, and there are soon to be 10 of us, and this is really the work that we do, is helping organizations answer this question of how we tell our story in a fundraising context. How do you capture the power of your mission and convey it to another person? That's always the challenge. And so we approach that in a lot of different ways, but our team and our approach with the clients that we work with is really, really driven by messaging. And you'll see as we go through this webinar sort of what that means to us. But I just want to emphasize that kind of the things that I'm sharing today are really examples and approaches that our team is using every day with all kinds of different organizations. So this is Fundraising Communications 2 out of 5. You can see how these kind of, and this will be throughout the sort of the school year, 27th fall through summer of 2018, and you can kind of see how these build on each other, moving from defining your case, which is more about what are we trying to communicate. Today is more about how do we express it. And then in the next few sessions, we'll be getting into, how do we get our volunteers on message, and what kinds of materials, fundraising materials, major donor materials can we produce that will make our jobs easier and make our volunteers more confident in going out and soliciting. So, and then the 5th session in the summer is really all about campaigns. So we take a lot of the stuff that we're covering in the other 4, but just look at it through a campaign lens. So that's really handy if you are in a campaign, thinking ahead to a campaign, or just know that you'll do one at some point. So today's session is really kind of where we take the ideas that we discussed in the first session and start to think about how we express them. So if you're sitting here thinking, well, I didn't attend the first session, so should I just drop out? No, you should not. These are all quite modular. You will be totally fine. You can go check out the first one. It's on our YouTube channel. And any of those of you who attended it and want to go back and refresh your memory, it's there for everyone. So let's jump in with kind of the broader question, which why do we focus on messages? I do a lot. You can hear a lot of different organizations talk about how they communicate or their case for support without really ever encountering this idea of messaging. Like, this is not a universal way of thinking and talking about this, but it's the way that we like to think and talk about it. And we're going to try to make the case for why that is. I'm going to start with a simple exercise that is originally attributed to, this is a quote attributed to Allen Ginsberg, or who knows which one of the beats came up with it in their hazy memories. But the idea is first thought, best thoughts. We're just going to start with a simple exercise. I want us all to just take a second. There's Alan. Think of an organization that you have personally supported, maybe some place you've given over the last year. If I just asked you, why should someone give money to that organization? Just what would you say? As quickly as possible, just write down or jot down in your mind a few major reasons or whatever comes to mind as contributing factors. Don't polish it up, just write it down, or just think about what would you say off the top of your head when someone asks you, oh, why did you give money to that organization? Or why should someone give money? I'll give you just a moment to think about it. I like this exercise because it gets us out of our fundraiser hats and puts us in our donor hats. And it's funny how long we can spend doing our fundraising work without thinking back to the fact that we are also all donors to different causes, and what does that experience tell us about being fundraisers. So be interested to hear what you all came up with, but I'd love to just share a few examples. So we did this. I asked some colleagues to do this, and here are some examples that my colleagues came up with. So the first was for a food pantry in Chicago, and the short version was, poverty on the north side is actually way worse than you might expect. And this food pantry has been in the community forever. They're one of the most active food banks in the whole city. And they're starting to do some really cool new stuff now to help people not just get food, but actually get out of poverty. Okay, so simple, short, easy. That's what comes off the top of your head when you think about a food pantry that you give to if you know a couple things about it. Someone else mentioned Planned Parenthood, and they told me they're the biggest, I'm giving because they're the biggest defenders of women's right to self-determination. And if they weren't there, no one else could do what they do as effectively. And the political climate right now is very threatening, so I felt that it was important that I try to do something to help. Again, very simple, straightforward. This third one, this is really interesting. This is a Chicago-based organization. It's an urban farm that's also a job training program. So first and foremost, they grow healthy food for communities that don't have as much access to it. But they run it as a job training program for people from disadvantaged neighborhoods who don't have good opportunities. And people go on to get good jobs in food service and other areas based on the experience they get at the farm. So it's this ingenious and really effective way to take on two serious problems with one program. So that's just three little examples. Yeah, be interested to hear what you all came up with. A few observations when we have people do this exercise. Usually people list maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 things if they're a real genius. Everything they say tends to be pretty simple and pretty straightforward, just sort of normal language, normal person talking about an organization. And some of them are actually pretty compelling. Like even with just off the top of your head, simple explanations, couple, 2, 3 different points, you start to get a sense of what's compelling about these organizations. So here's where I'm going with this. If people can only, off the top of their heads, remember, 3 or 4 or 5 things about your case for support, how do you make sure they're the right things? What are you doing to take to take care of that mental image of your organization that you're creating in your donors' minds to make it whatever you would want it to be? The answer to that is messaging. It's the most overlooked discipline in fundraising communications, and it's also the cheapest way to make everything that you communicate better. You don't really have to spend money to deliver better messaging. You just need to spend some time thinking about it, pushing harder on some ideas, just living with it a little bit, and trying some of the approaches that we're going to outline today. So the core idea here is that however you want to articulate your case for support, whether that's a narrative case statement or you know, in a video or in a presentation deck or whatever the different medium that you might be using, strong, well-defined messages are the building blocks of a strong case for support. You'll remember if you were in the first session last time, we put up this slide that kind of looks like a ransom note. It says, when we're defining your case for support, it's a set of messages that you communicate to prepare your prospects for a solicitation. So see, even back in webinar number one, we're thinking ahead to this one and laying that little seed that it's messages. So if it's messages, what is a message anyway? And by the way, that is Jane Austen. All of these, because today's session is all about writing and how you use words to convey your ideas, we're going to be visited by the ghosts of a number of famous authors who have much wisdom to share with us. So that's why we care about messages, why we think that's a good place to start in expressing your case for support. Let's dig into what is a message and how do we make them. So, simple working definition for you. A message is a statement that is designed to move an audience. Now, I didn't take this out of some textbook or anything. It's just sort of, this is how, there are probably different approaches or different definitions of this. This is how we see it. This is how we think of them in our work. We're trying to work with organizations to come up with these core propositions, these core statements that try to take an audience from where they are and move them somewhere. So that might mean inspiring them to action. So from sort of apathy to action. It might be from sort of ignorance to understanding, like it may be the move that you're making is to get an idea to click with them, where they say, oh, I get it. Oh, I get how that program works. Oh, I get what this vision is all about. So sometimes the movement is more about understanding. The thing is, you have to be moving an audience somewhere. So the counter example I like to use here is, if I tell you that after this webinar, I'm going to go to Chipotle, like that is true. But it's not, and it is a statement, but it's not moving you anywhere. It's not moving the audience. It's just, you're looking for, this is a message, it's language that does something. So let's look at some examples, makes it all much clearer. My favorite, Alzheimer's disease is the defining public health challenge of our time. This is, I think, a perfect message because it states something very clearly and straightforwardly, and it does move you somewhere. It asks you to go from whatever your frame or thinking about Alzheimer's is, or about when you think about what are the big, diseases that affect people's lives, or that get a lot of attention or federal funding, or however you might look at it. This is trying to move you to a place of putting Alzheimer's at sort of the pinnacle of that. I think it's a perfect message. No child should miss out on a great education for financial reasons. Again, simple statement. It's trying to move you to a state of kind of belief or conviction. It's saying, come join us in this kind of shared conviction about what is right and what is fair and what is, what is just. Simple example, this campaign will determine our future. This is about the blandest message that you could have, but it's it is a message. It's advancing a proposition. It's trying to move you somewhere, trying to bring you on board with a particular kind of understanding or viewpoint. So I've just shown you 3 really simple little messages, and the idea is that when you're building your case, you can actually build it out of just those kinds of really simple messages. You can figure out what they are, figure out which ones you need, sort of how they relate to each other, what order they go in, how they build on each other. You can build a really strong case, one little idea at a time. So let's talk about how you make them. Here's the floating head of Ernest Hemingway and his amazing turtleneck. If I started to write elaborately, or like someone introducing or presenting something, I found that I could cut that scroll work or ornament out and throw it away and start with the first true, simple, declarative sentence I had written. So that's Hemingway talking about his writing approach, but it's also, I think, a really useful point of entry for thinking about messaging for us, for our purposes. So let's talk about what makes a good fundraising message. And again, this is not a textbook definition. This is just what I and our team has really found to be useful for the kinds of messages that organizations need in campaigns and in fundraising. We tend to look for maybe 3 things. First, you need to make a compelling claim. You need to create immediate understanding, something that clicks. And finally, this is maybe most important, it's got to work in conversation. So let's dive into these and show some examples. So a good fundraising message has to make a compelling claim. So we're going to talk a lot about writing. We're going to talk about different ways to phrase stuff. But as we do that, and you can fixate on the writing and what's the best word choice and the best construction, and all of that matters, as you'll see. But you do have to start with a compelling claim, some sort of idea. So here's Herman Melville, who I just far more handsome than I was prepared for. To produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. No great and enduring volume can ever be written on the flea, though many there be that have tried it. It's from Moby Dick. So you have to start with big ideas and compelling ideas, and make sure that you're grounding your case and your messages in what actually is interesting or compelling or exciting about your organization. So a few different ways to approach that. Start by make sure you're saying something substantive. This is where one of the reasons I like that Alzheimer's quote, or that Alzheimer's message. There's nothing rhetorical going on here. These are just normal kind of unremarkable words. There's no like, really fancy word choices, or really there's no elaborate, structure to this sentence. It's just pure substance delivered in a really bracing, strong, direct way. The strength of this idea is its substance. One way to get toward that is to try to look for the core, the core substance that's at the heart of what you're trying to say. And often this means pushing harder on language that you already have. So here's an example from a school, something that a school might say. Alongside our recent investments in capital and programs, we must also invest in our school endowment to ensure our strongest future. So that's fine. Nothing wrong with that sentence. It feels very much like stuff that schools write all the time. But if we're trying to get to the core message, think about what is in there that would actually move someone. What's in there that maybe someone would remember? What's in there that actually is the heart of the idea? So we gave ourselves, this was from an actual project, so we pushed on it, just pushed on it from different directions, tried, no, maybe it's really about this, maybe it's really about that, or what are we really trying to say here? What we're really trying to say, we decided, was that the endowment is the most important investment that we can make in our school's future right now. And then you can expand on that, you can explain it, and sort of build out from it, but the core is that you're saying that right now, for us, the endowment is the most important thing we could do. So that's the strongest claim. And I think that's actually the version that maybe, again, it's a school. Think about all the parents in that school. Think about how they all talk to each other and like everything is word of mouth. This is maybe closer to an idea that could actually transmit by word of mouth. Someone might actually, they would at least have a chance at remembering that and maybe believing it. We're talking about making a compelling claim. Look for ways to make your ideas feel big. Like try to look at what you're trying to express. See I like to ask, what's the biggest version of this? Or like, what does it add up to? If you've got a sentence that's got like 3 or 4 different parts in it, kind of like that last one did, like what does it all add up to that's bigger? So here's an example from a client. This is a wonderful organization. It's a safety net hospital that has for years, decades really, has been doing, in addition to being the safety net hospital that everyone relies on, it's also been doing all this really interesting stuff around preventative care and community health and public health. They've been publishing research on public health in a way that you don't expect from the safety net hospital. So the initial version, and then what they're trying to say is that all those things that they've been doing are now very current and are now very important in the world of healthcare reform. This was from a few years back. It was a different time. So healthcare reform is bringing a new focus on prevention, community health, and affordability. For decades, we've been a leader in these critical areas. Okay, that's fine. I think that says what we're trying to say. How do you make that idea feel bigger? Because it was really important to them. So we kept pushing on it. Here's where we landed. American healthcare is going where we've always been. So that's like the core message, is that we've been ahead of the curve. Like we've been doing stuff that people are just now coming around to and trying to roll out across the country. So that core message makes the idea feel big. I added this slide last year. Somehow it just started to feel necessary. When we're working with clients, we will often, you're always trying to find that boundary. Like, what's the most ambitious, what's the biggest version of this claim that we can make while still having our feet on the ground? So when I'm talking about like pushing to get to the boldest or the strongest version of something, have this caveat in mind. Like it has to be something you can actually back up and that you can actually defend. But what I usually find is that most organizations are kind of undershooting this rather than overshooting it. There's not that many organizations that are out there just like saying a bunch of unsubstantiated stuff. Like it's just, most organizations err on the side of being a little too cautious or like a little too, let me kind of qualify that. Let me just, that might not be, are we 100% sure of that? Can we back that up? Like, there are usually bigger, bolder ways of speaking that are still quite credible. And I think most organizations need a nudge in that direction. But still, gotta keep our feet on the ground. Okay, so second point that we mentioned about what makes good fundraising messages is that they have to create immediate understanding. So here, phone call from James Baldwin. You want to write a sentence as clean as a bone. That is the goal. My favorite thing, I love this quote, my favorite thing about it is that in the first sentence, he says what he's trying to say, and then in the second sentence, he demonstrates it. That is the goal. Perfect, clean as a bone sentence right there. So we're talking about wanting fundraising messaging to create immediate understanding. Really, you have to keep pushing to clarify. So trying to find the idea that's lurking in your language that makes your language click or makes the understanding click. So here's an example. This is from a school. They were doing this campaign that okay. So backstory. I'll take the language off the screen. Backstory is their previous campaign had been a bunch of like academic facilities and buildings and classroom stuff, and they had really invested in the academic program, so people were feeling good about that. And now they're going into a new campaign that was about other stuff, and it had this kind of, we were kind of nervous in this campaign, like, can we really go out as a school with a campaign that doesn't have academic classroom, projects in it. It has a performing arts center in it, it's got athletics. Those are the two main priorities. It's mostly around, but there's no academic core to it. So people were nervous about that because it's a school and that's, the core of their kind of identity. So the original language was, we've always been recognized for our outstanding academic programs, yet we know that our extracurricular and co-curricular programs can be just as important in shaping our children's lives. So what they're trying to say is like all the other stuff, the arts and theater and drama and public speaking and, athletics and being on a team and learning a sport, all the stuff that this campaign touches that's important too. But we felt like this language was still, I don't know, it felt like it was like apologizing for something. So the version we came up with that I think once we saw this, we kind of felt like it clicked. It's like, oh, this campaign's about all the learning that happens outside the classroom. Everything you learn through being on a team, working hard at a sport, facing your fears, going up on stage, performing, doing something that maybe you didn't think you could do. This campaign is about all of those moments and all that stuff that happened outside the classroom. So it also gives, the immediate understanding it creates is just, oh, now I understand what unites these projects, what that common thread is. When you talk about creating immediate understanding, a really important discipline is to just have one idea per message. If you have, I think just pretty much as a rule, as close to a rule as I'll give you, a message has to be pretty much just one idea. If you have like multiple ideas, that's a list, that's a paragraph. It's not a message. So the question that puts to you is then, okay, what is the one idea? So let's take some starter language here on the left. This is from an educational setting. The annual fund provides funding that supports a wide range of initiatives, including financial aid, faculty professional development, new program innovation, technology, and equipment. So it's fine, nothing wrong with it. Fine language. It does explain some stuff, but what's the message in there? Like, what's the piece of that you kind of are trying to move someone with? And so I actually, on all these other slides, I've been showing you the before and the after. Here, the problem is that the way this is written, I don't know what the after is. Like, I don't know what the core message is. It might be that your annual fund gift benefits every student every day. Maybe that's what all this stuff adds up to. It could be saying that your annual fund gift supports all the things we love most about our school. Maybe that's what we're trying to say with this. It's like saying, everything that made you choose this school and distinguishes us and makes us so special, that's what this is all about. Or maybe it's just saying that your annual fund is the most important gift you can make to benefit our students today. All three of those are, I think, perfectly solid messages, and any one of those could be the message for your annual fund. But you kind of have to push on it to figure out which one you're really going for. So when we talk about creating immediate understanding, a lot of times that's kind of like, think about it like creating a framework. You don't have to explain everything in your messaging. In fact, you shouldn't. You shouldn't have a whole bunch of detail in there. But like, how are you creating the framework into which now all the details make sense? So we were working with this environmental organization. They have this, a lot of environmental organizations have this funny communications challenge where the mission is like as big as the world, and these just big, idealistic, urgent, driving concerns. And then a lot of the work in environmental work these days is like pretty complicated. A lot of partnerships, a lot of like projects where you have many partners working together. You're not just buying up land anymore. You're creating, interesting like market-based programs to incentivize different, farmers to use their land differently. Or in this case, this organization was going to do a survey of all the ways that water flowed back into a main water source, and all those little connections and like they were literally talking about like mapping out tens of thousands of different culverts across like a multi-county area, and then going and like doing little improvements at each of them to prevent pollutants and runoff from flowing back into the water source. How do you, like, what's the short version of that? There's no, so we went back to this question of like, how do you create a framework in which people can get what that's about? And this was that. So really this is a project that's all about making tens of thousands of little improvements that add up to a major impact on the whole ecosystem or on the whole water system. And then we can go in and explain it. But you've got that framework. You're like, oh, okay, there's not going to be some big centerpiece project in this. It's going to be a bunch of little things. And that's, you're preparing your donor to understand that. Look for aha moments. You know, think about, often just go back and think about what was your aha moment in understanding a project. Like, as a staff member or as a donor, what was the experience for you that helped you understand exactly what was at stake in that program or that campaign or that mission or whatever it was? Go back to that aha moment and try to express it. So we were doing some work with a chapter of the United Way. And this United Way organization was in the middle of a really interesting transition where they were moving away from the sort of old United Way model of sort of sprinkling funding across a really, really wide range of organizations. They're moving toward an approach where they really have specific neighborhoods that they invest in, and then in each of those neighborhoods they create a very focused, very like partnership-driven approach where they get all, you know, they look at the key issues in that neighborhood, and get all the different organizations in that neighborhood to encourage them to work together around those challenges. So it's this big shift, and they need to sort of walk their donors through that shift and help them understand why it's not, you know, it's not like your grandparents' United Way anymore. And they have to specifically make the case for why is it neighborhood driven. You could do the whole city, you could do individual organizations. Why focus at that sort of medium level of neighborhoods? So the message that project ultimately landed on, which I really like, is that our citywide strategy is based on neighborhoods because neighborhoods are big enough to truly matter and yet small enough to truly change. So simple little explanation. Okay, so we've been talking about how you create immediate understanding with messaging. The final point that we had in terms of making messages is that a good fundraising message has to work in conversation. And one thing I hope you can see from the examples that I've been showing you is that this is all pretty much conversational language. And you know, you can write it down, it's fine on the page, but there are ways of writing that only work on the page, and then there are ways of writing that you can work on the page or say out loud. And so much of fundraising is driven by major gifts and by relationship building with donors. And so much of relationship building is driven by conversations, by word of mouth, by perceptions of the organization in kind of a cohesive community around the organization. So you want ideas that can travel word of mouth, that your board members can remember and say out loud when they're engaging with people. So these are all just, this is probably the most important point, I would say. So let's go back and approach this from the standpoint of more authors. And here we're going to revisit a little squabble. There's William Faulkner speaking about Ernest Hemingway. He has never been known to use a word that might send a reader to a dictionary. Hemingway says, poor Faulkner, does he really think that big emotions come from big words? So, you know, what this shows you, apart from just like how fragile masculinity is, it just, you know, that this is, people have been sort of having this debate for a long time about, you know, the quality of language. Is it in the ideas that it expresses, or is it in the sort of like the artfulness or the craft with which you express it? I'm gonna, for our purposes, I'm gonna come down on Ernest's side here and say, look, we have to not be afraid of simple language. In fact, we should probably be a little bit distrustful of fancy language. So some examples. This isn't our last chance, but it's our best chance. I saw this in, it was in environmental organizations materials, and I thought it was just, I just liked the simple words. It's actually very artful in the way that it's crafted. There's you know, sort of it kind of rhymes with itself, but just simple language that you could actually remember and that could stick with you. So one little test we like to apply when we're trying to do this, get to this kind of conversational language, is, would a human say it? So we see this a lot in areas of the nonprofit sector that are a little bit jargony, and that's a lot of areas of the nonprofit sector at this point. So, you know, as the nonprofit sector has professionalized, we've developed all of this very specific language that we use to talk to each other. And it's not bad. Like, it's great for talking to each other. It allows us to be precise. But when you're speaking out of doors, when you're talking to donors, go back to human language. So a good example, so from a food bank or a hunger relief organization, no child should grow up in a food insecure household. That is the term of art. It's the, you know, that's the actual statistically sort of definable and measurable unit of study is food insecurity and what is a food insecure household. But, you know, for Ernest, the question is really, the core idea is really that no child should have to wonder where her next meal is coming from. No parent should have to wonder where their child's next meal is coming from. There's a human truth at the heart of this that we need to express if we're trying to engage human donors. And, you know, another simple way is to just make sure that you're sticking with nouns and verbs. So this is, you know, going back to the, I like to pick on education a little bit because there's just so much interesting, non-interesting jargon in the world of education. So, you know, we are committed to a child-centered, transformational, holistic, experiential education. This could actually literally have been just a whole slide of educational buzzwords. Like, I don't actually even, neither does Mr. Hemingway, I don't actually know what that's trying to say, because it's all adjectives. If you take out, like, one good thing I like to do is, like, just take your pen and cross out all the adjectives and then see what's left. So that would be, we are committed to education. Yeah, everything else in here is either an adjective or like a, you know, child-centered, like a noun, like a phrase functioning as an adjective. We are committed to education. That's your sentence. That's like, so you've got like this like rice cake of a sentence with like adjective syrup poured on it, and it's not good. So look for sentences built around nouns and verbs. It will keep you honest and keep you focused on language that actually is more powerful, works more effectively in conversation. So one way we like to do that is this little game that we play with board members or campaign steering committees. We will often give them these little writing prompts, give them a little thing that says, you know, this campaign is all about, and then blank. Or if you only remember one thing, it's blank. And have them do the writing exercise with you, both they will come up with interesting ideas, and also they'll struggle with it in a way that makes them more forgiving and more charitable towards the work that you ultimately put in front of them. So here's the exercise I want to show you. You can do this with your board, you know, anytime. Ask them to just write one sentence to express why we matter, but you'll put some rules on it. They can only use one adjective and no commas, because commas allow you to cheat and like run a bunch of clauses together and have one sentence that's actually like 3 sentences. So try this one, see what happens, see what people come up with, see if they can get to the heart of it. Some of the things you get back from this will be not compelling, but like a few people in your board will probably do something really cool with this and might actually help you cut through and get to some useful messages. So, closing thought from Flannery O'Connor, anything that makes you overly conscious of the language is bad for the story, usually. Perfectly stated. Okay, so that concludes kind of the whole section about making messages, how you build them. Now let's talk about, once you have some messages, what can you do with them? So we're going to walk through one kind of extended example here that is from a food bank. I like to use a food bank as an example because it's just like the most universal, kind of, it's like the oldest form, it's got to be like the oldest form of charity, right? So again, we're going to start with, we're going to do before and after. Start with the before. Here's the original case statement for a campaign for a food bank. I distilled this. So according to Feeding America's Hunger in America study, there are over 100,000 food. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to read this whole thing. That'd be crazy. It's not even that long, but like how panicked were you that I was going to like read this whole slide to you? And it's only like 3.5 paragraphs. So to begin with, notice how exhausting sort of full narrative language is once you start thinking about things in terms of the core messages. So I gave myself the challenge. I took this and sat down with it for like 10 minutes and just tried to go through it, and I actually like marked it up with a pencil. Like, what are the key messages in this draft? I looked through it. It turns out there are basically 5. And I didn't express these in any kind of fancy way. I just kind of sketched out what roughly I thought they were saying. First, that hunger in our city is a far greater challenge than most of us realize. That despite all the need, we're actually far behind other cities in providing the kind of food support that families need. This campaign is going to take us from below average to actually being a model for other cities. We're going to do it through the power of a network and partners so we can reach every neighborhood. And it's really ambitious. It's an ambitious vision that's going to take all of us. That's basically what's going on in that draft. And so, you know, you could do more with these messages. If my team were working on it, we would really work on trying to figure out, okay, if these are the 5 things we're trying to say, what's the most powerful way to say each of them? And can we maybe get it down to 4, or is there like a 6th one that we're forgetting about? Like, you can work on this more. But this is just kind of the quick version. So start with, let's say that we've gone through that exercise and we've boiled down to our key messages. Remember, this is a slide we showed on the first webinar, that your case for support is a set of messages that you communicate to prepare people for a solicitation. And once you have that set of messages, it can flow into all of these different kinds of things. So let's show how that would work for this imaginary food bank with its 5 key messages. So the first thing you might do, if you've got 5 key messages, you can create a really handy little cheat sheet. Take your 5 key messages and put some little factoids or proof points or little bits of stories next to them. If you can put your key ideas on a single page, maybe front and back, and then put that in the hands of your board members, you will be a hero. Like that's all your board members probably want. Like that's what they want, help with the simple ways to talk about your organization. They actually, in most cases, feel kind of self-conscious because they're like, well, I'm a board member. I'm on the board of this organization. Why do I still struggle to when I'm at a cookout and someone asks me, oh, what's that organization you serve on the board of? And I struggle to say what we're about, even though I'm on the board. A lot of your board members have that, and whether they share that anxiety with you, a lot of them have it. So if you can give them a cheat sheet, like, you're the hero. So all I did with this was just, I kind of actually went back to that original, the before version, and just started pulling out the little proof points and figuring out where do those go next to the key messages. So this is a great thing to have. You can use it. It's also a great basis for doing message training. Once you've got this, you can put it in your board members' hands and say, okay, now let's do some role playing. Let's do some like real world scenarios. And they'll feel a lot better about doing that exercise when you're giving them something helpful to work with. But messages, you can also, of course, apply them in a whole bunch of different media. So let's say you're doing a brochure. If you've got 5 key messages and you're doing a brochure, maybe you do one spread focused on each of those messages. Or maybe you look at those messages and have them sequence out throughout the brochure as kind of like, that gives you the structure for your content for the brochure. So you could do a nice 2-page spread where the headline is that first message. Hunger is a much bigger challenge here than most of us realize. Get a little block of copy that substantiates that, put some stats along the bottom, show a story of a family on the other page. You've got an instant brochure spread out of one key message. If you're doing a video, it's really helpful to have messages to give you ideas for content. So when we showed 5 key messages, should we do a series of 5 short videos, each of which takes one of those ideas and just tries to deliver on it? And you have to think about not just telling those messages, but showing them. So if the message is about how hunger is a bigger problem than people realize, maybe you tell a story from someone who talks about how they were sort of hiding in plain sight as someone who was, worried about feeding their family. Like, no one in my life, at my office, in my church, no one knew that we were only getting by with help from the local food pantry. Tell that story as a way to not just sort of tell that message, but show that message. So again, we could go through all the stuff that's on here and show examples of how once you've got, the 5 key messages, or whatever, however many it is for you, 5 is a nice number. Once you've got that, like, maybe that shapes a campaign of 5 different of annual appeals, or maybe that's how you structure the content on your website. Maybe you do a rotation of social media posts throughout, your editorial calendar for social media that kind of rotates through some of those main points in a kind of a planned way. All of these things are just, everything gets a little bit easier, really, once you kind of know what your core messages are and you've got them expressed in a really simple way. Okay, so let's recap, and then we'll take a few minutes for some questions. See if we have some questions. So going back to the idea that strong, well-defined messages are the building blocks of a strong case. If you can boil it down to a few key ideas, you've got what you need to build out all the different case versions that you might need. What makes a good fundraising message? A strong, compelling claim. You have to actually be saying something. Creates immediate understanding, and it works in conversation. Let's take a look at, see what questions may have come in. Let me see. All right, so I got a question here. This one, I'm glad somebody submitted this. The question is, do we need different messages for different audiences, or do we need to have the same, for individual versus corporate is really what they're asking. But I want to kind of generalize out from the question, because this kind of comes up for every organization. My feeling overall is that well, you want to be able to tailor your messages for different audiences, and you want to have a set of messages that can apply or can be kind of adapted to different audiences. I feel like the real challenge, or like the more important challenge, is to get your sort of universal messages. So I think it's probably for most organizations more useful to focus on getting your core messages down first, rather than like driving yourself crazy thinking about all your different audiences. So do that first, and then once you have that, then you can think about do we need some different messages for different audiences? Do we need are there like 2 or 3 extra messages that we would only use for a corporate audience that maybe emphasize the sort of corporate benefit or corporate social responsibility angle that maybe we wouldn't use for individuals? So maybe you have like 5 or 3, maybe 3 like really core messages that go to everyone, and then 2 or 3 that you use for corporations and maybe a couple that you use for individuals. So think about it that way. You can do more audience-specific messages, and especially as you get into more of like the public phase of a campaign, you're really targeting different kinds of broader communications to different kinds of audiences. But I still really think most organizations would benefit from starting with kind of the core and figuring out what that is. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions, and if you have other questions, let me say this: if you have other questions, send them in by email. Let me go ahead to my email here. There we go. Yes, apb@campbellcompany.com. So if you have questions, please send them in. I will respond to them. Before we sign off, I just want to close with one final bit of authorial wisdom from Virginia Woolf, who tells us that words do not live in dictionaries, they live in the mind. I like to end on this because it expresses that this isn't a writing challenge. We're not trying to create beautiful pieces of writing. We're trying to create an understanding and a sense of emotional investment and personal connection and commitment in the minds of our audiences. So when you're thinking about words and word choices, it's not just about that's what it's really about. What are the words that do that job for you, that move your audience in the ways that you want? So this has been our second webinar in the Fundraising Communications series. Our next one in February is called Engaging Volunteers with Your Case. We're going to go through a few different helpful, hopefully, strategies that respond to this challenge that we see just from almost every organization we work with, which is how do we get our volunteers on message, or really how do we get them comfortable with being, doing the sort of spokesperson part of their jobs. So that's one of the newer sessions that we've added based on organizations' needs. And then in May, we've got our session on fundraising materials. We're going to show a lot of examples, real campaign pieces and fundraising communications materials, and how organizations are using those to prepare for major gift conversations. What are they using in conversations? What are they actually using across the table with them, between their donors and them? What are they sending or leaving behind? How are they using video? We'll talk about like more traditional stuff, print pieces. We'll talk a fair amount about presentation approaches and presentation decks and flip books and different things you can use that are more conversational. We'll talk about iPad apps and more innovative approaches as well. So that's an interesting session. And then any of you who have campaigns on the brain in any way, would love to have you check out number 5 in July on campaign case development. So with that, thank you all for joining us and for hanging in there through our webinar series. We hope you'll stick with us. And again, send me any questions you have. Thanks so much.